With Saturn in your first house of your natal birth chart, you have a fear of being seen, so you kind of might feel self-conscious. Like if you're out in public, you always feel that people are looking at you. With Saturn in the second house, I think that you have a fear of making too much money and getting really high in your career and then losing all of your money. With Saturn in the third house, you might have a fear of carrying on like a deep conversation with people, and you also might have personal issues and, like having a really hard time in school. With Saturn in the fourth house is about your mom. So if you have Saturn in there, then that could mean that you had issues growing up, like a really, really bad, like the worst of the worst childhood. And it can also mean that maybe you have a fear of your mom. With Saturn in your fifth house is about children. And so if you have Saturn there, then that might mean, you have a fear of having kids, which means like you think that they're too much responsibility or they're too expensive. So you don't want kids, or also a Saturn with your fifth house can also mean like maybe you have difficulties there, like maybe you're infertile or something like that. So that's when Saturn is placed in your fifth house. Saturn in your sixth house. So sixth house rules your health issues. So you might kind of have a fear of being really in tune with your body, and that's not a good placement because all your life you're gonna have like really bad health issues. With Saturn in the seventh house is the house of marriage. So you might have a fear of getting legally married under the law. Like you might want to be in a relationship for 10 years but not get legally married. I'm not really sure what the fear is. It's probably financial. Like if you fear that the two of you are a legally married couple and you go to the courthouse and you sign papers and you're legally married instead of just dating, that you're afraid you're gonna be sued for child support, or you have to get alimony, or you're scared that having a legal spouse is going to, they're going to get legally married and then a month later they're going to take up, off with all your stuff, or that they're going to want a prenup and want half of the things that you already have your name on and you already work so hard. So with Saturn in the seventh house, marriage is just a piece of paper. Saturn in the eighth house is a really good placement because the eighth house is about death. So having Saturn here is a really good thing, and it means that you're not going to die until you're at least 80. The ninth house, one of the things that it includes, the ninth house includes a lot of different things, and one of the things that it includes is formal education. So with Saturn here, you might have a problem, like you might have something against like getting a formal education. Maybe you had a bad experience, maybe you had a really, really bad teacher in, high school or something like that. And you don't want to go to college because you have personal issues with, getting a formal education. And then with Saturn in the 10th house is about your career. So maybe you kind of have a fear of being really successful and, working on a career for 30 years and then it all falling apart. And the 10th house also represents your dad. So if you had a problem with your dad, like you guys weren't getting along or, something happened to him. You can see that by looking and seeing the Saturn in your 10th house. Saturn in the 7th house, well, with the 7th house, that represents friends and family. So with the Saturn in your 11th house, you do kind of have a fear of maybe being in groups, or maybe you have a really big fear of public speaking. So Saturn in the 12th house is really not a good thing. If you're really into astrology, you already know that that doesn't sound good at all. And I also touched in some of my other videos about, having Saturn in the 12th house. The 12th house is the worst house, and offhand, I would say that having anything in the 12th house is a bad idea. The 12th house is our subconscious. It's bad karma from a past life, and it's our fears. It's also the planet that you can look into, or I'm sorry, the house that you can look into if you want to go into, jails and prisons and mental hospitals and stuff like that. And then on top of that, the worst planet that you can have is Saturn. So that's, your planet where you're very fearful, and that's where things that, your kind of issues that you're working in life. So to put your Saturn in the 12th house, if you were born with your Saturn in the 12th house, that means that you were born with severe mental issues, and you have a lot of fears, and that's really not a good placement. That is a placement that indicates self-harm, suicide, drugs, alcohol, tweaking, and it indicates addictions, whether it's a sex addiction or pornography or strippers. And so unfortunately, the last house that you would have it in, the 12th house, is not a good placement to have Saturn.